September 20, 1996. A day that began like any other in Belgrade, Montana, a town known for its quiet streets, the distant hum of the Gallatin River, and the steady rhythm of small-town life. But for 15-year-old Danielle Danni Houchins, that day would mark the beginning of a mystery that still haunts this community, and one that would remain unsolved for decades. The morning was like any other. The sun was high, and the world seemed full of possibility. But by the evening, Danny would vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and a family shattered by grief. She told her family she was just going to the river, a familiar spot where she often went to fish or simply unwind. But hours passed, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, she didn't come back. No one could have known it then, but the moment Danny stepped into that afternoon, her world, along with her family's, was about to come to an end. The police were called. Search parties combed the town and its outskirts. Yet, despite their best efforts, nothing was found. What had happened to Danny? Where had she gone? And more importantly, who had taken her? As the night wore on, her mother, with nothing but her flashlight and her mother's intuition, ventured out alone. She needed to know. She had to know. Who could have done this to her? Was this the work of a stranger, or someone who knew her intimately? And in a town like Belgrade, with its quiet streets and peaceful ways, how could something like this happen? The mystery deepens as the search for answers begins. Hours passed, the night deepened, but still no sign of Danny. Her mother, having searched every corner of Belgrade and beyond, could only hold on to hope, even as the darkness seemed to swallow it whole. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that the search party stumbled upon something that would change everything. A discovery that would send shockwaves through this quiet town and echo through the years to come. They pulled her from the river, face down, the water still clinging to her clothes, as if it too wanted to hide the truth. She was Danny. But she was no longer the girl who had walked out of her house just hours before. The hope that had driven her family to search through the night collapsed into the harsh, unyielding truth. Danni Houchins was dead. The investigators stood in stunned silence. They had expected to find a missing girl, perhaps a runaway or a victim of circumstance. But this was something else. Danny's body was discovered just yards from the very spot she had mentioned to her family, but there were no obvious clues, no signs of a struggle, no marks, no bruises, nothing that suggested a violent encounter. The scene was chilling in its normalcy, as though Danny had simply slipped away from life. But the questions were already rising. What had happened here? How had a young girl, just minutes away from her home, ended up in this grim state? Who was responsible for this horrific act? Was it the work of a stranger lurking in the shadows of this seemingly peaceful town? Or could the killer have been someone close to Danny? A friend? A neighbor? Someone she trusted? The truth, it seemed, was as elusive as the morning fog, nearly impossible to see, but suffocating in its presence. Time moved on. But for Danny's family, the days bled into one another, each one marked by a painful, unanswered question. Why? The police worked tirelessly, following lead after lead, but each trail ended in a wall of silence. There were no witnesses, no evidence, nothing but the grim discovery of a young girl found in a river, and the haunting memories of a family forever changed. Years turned into decades, and the agony of not knowing what happened to Danny only deepened. For her family, the pain never faded. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, they all came and went, each one a reminder of the daughter they lost. And each year, the hope for justice seemed to slip further out of reach. But in the quiet corners of the case, there were still whispers, hints of something that could break the silence. But little did anyone know, the key to solving this case would not come from the traditional methods that had failed for so long. It would come from something far more revolutionary. Something that hadn't even been available in 1996. In a world that was just beginning to understand the power of DNA, new technologies were on the horizon, ready to unlock the mystery that had confounded investigators for so long. How much longer would Danny's family have to wait? How many years would pass before they could finally put the pieces of this tragic puzzle together? Could this new technology unlock the door to the truth, one that had remained shut for so long? Fast forward to 2024. Technology had finally caught up to the past. What had once been a hopeless mystery, tangled in time and unanswered questions, now had the potential to be unraveled. Advances in DNA testing and forensic genetic genealogy had become the modern detectives' most powerful tools that were finally being put to work on Danni Houchins' case. The DNA led them to a man named Paul Hutchinson. At first glance, he seemed an unlikely suspect, an ordinary man with an unremarkable past. A father of two, a husband, a fisheries biologist working for the Montana Bureau of Land Management. No criminal history, no red flags. He was a man of science, of nature, dedicated to his family and his work. But could someone so seemingly ordinary have been capable of such an extraordinary evil? The breakthrough came when investigators traced Hutchinson's DNA to a distant relative, someone in his family tree who had submitted their genetic information to a public genealogy database. It was this connection that would ultimately point them to him. But the question remained: how was he connected to Danni? What was the link between this seemingly innocent man and the brutal death of a young girl? What was the connection between Paul Hutchinson and Danni? Was he someone she knew, someone who had crossed her path long before that fateful day? Or was there something even darker at play here? How could someone so ordinary, so unassuming, have been capable of such an unspeakable crime? On July 23, 2024, after years of investigation, Paul Hutchinson was finally called in for questioning. The moment he entered the interrogation room, a wave of tension swept through the air. It was an atmosphere thick with unspoken questions and uneasy anticipation. For nearly 2 hours, Hutchinson's behavior would defy any notion of calm, his reactions unraveling before the detectives' eyes. The detectives wasted no time. They showed Hutchinson a photo of Danni Houchins, her young face forever frozen in time. The moment the image landed in front of him, Hutchinson's discomfort became impossible to ignore. He slumped in his chair, his entire body recoiling, his gaze faltered, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding the photograph. The reaction was chilling. Was this the face of a guilty man, or was something else at play? As the detectives pressed on, they probed deeper into Hutchinson's past, asking questions that had remained unanswered for years. But Hutchinson's responses were evasive, his answers incomplete and disjointed. Every time they pushed closer to the truth, he seemed to shrink further into himself, like a man cornered by his own lies. His body language, shifting in his seat, fidgeting with his collar, wiping sweat from his brow, spoke volumes about his unease. Was he feeling the weight of his own guilt, or was he simply overwhelmed by the pressure of the moment? The detectives pressed him further, asking about his whereabouts on the night of Danni's disappearance. Hutchinson's story, already shaky, began to unravel. His alibi was inconsistent, full of gaps that didn't add up. Each time they caught him in a contradiction, his face flushed with a mixture of frustration and fear. He became defensive, his tone rising, his hands flailing as though trying to physically push away the questions. At one point, Hutchinson's defensiveness reached a breaking point. His emotions, long suppressed, surfaced in a burst of agitation. He slammed his fist onto the table, startling the detectives, before immediately sinking back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. It was as though he had momentarily lost control, perhaps of his emotions, perhaps of his own conscience. Was Basil Hutchinson react this way? Was he desperately trying to hide the truth? Or was the pressure of the interrogation breaking him down in ways the detectives couldn't have predicted? Could these signs of guilt, his emotional outbursts, his inconsistent alibi, were the clues they needed to unravel the mystery? Or was there something deeper at play here, something that no one could have foreseen? Hours after his grueling interrogation, Paul Hutchinson made a chilling and final decision. It was a call that would echo through the lives of those who had spent years seeking justice for Danielle Houchins. He dialed 911, his voice shaking with panic, pleading for help, before abruptly hanging up. When deputies arrived at his home, they found nothing but the echoes of his desperation. Hutchinson was gone. He had ended his life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, leaving behind nothing but questions. What drove him to take this step? Was it guilt that finally consumed him? Or was it the weight of years spent living in fear of being exposed? Whatever his reasoning, Hutchinson's act of final escape only deepened the pain for those left behind. The family of Danni Houchins, who had waited decades for answers, were now faced with yet another betrayal. The justice they had so long sought would remain elusive. For Danni's family, the news of Hutchinson's suicide would bring no relief, no justice, no closure. Instead, it left them with a sense of hopelessness, a final, cruel chapter to a nightmare that had already stretched on for too long. The man they believed could have been responsible for taking their daughter's life had escaped the consequences, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. In the end, Hutchinson's suicide did nothing to quiet the storm of grief and frustration that had been building for years. Danni's family, already battered by loss, were left with more questions than ever before. Could they ever truly know the truth? Could they ever find peace? And in his final act, did Hutchinson, by taking his own life, dodged the justice that Danni deserved? Would Danni's family ever get the justice they so desperately sought? Or had Hutchinson's suicide severed the final thread of hope for closure? Was the pain of losing his victim and the burden of living with what he had done too much for him to bear? Or was there something darker, something deeper that led him to make that fateful choice? The news that Danni's family was far from over, even as they finally learned the truth about her killer, it was clear that justice would never be fully served. The long-awaited answers came with a tragic twist, a twist that no one, least of all Danni's loved ones, had anticipated. After years of waiting, the man responsible for her death was never going to face the consequences of his actions. Instead, they were left with the raw, haunting reality that they would never see him stand trial. The truth, while freeing in some ways, was also a burden too heavy to carry. Stephanie's words were not just an acknowledgement of Hutchinson's guilt. They were a reflection of the deep, unhealed wound that had been inflicted upon the Houchins family. The realization that the man who had taken Danni's life would never face justice was a bitter pill to swallow. For years, they had believed that one day they would see him held accountable. But now, that hope had been extinguished in an instant. The family's fight for justice had come to an unthinkable end. In the aftermath of Hutchinson's death, the family found themselves grappling with an unbearable reality. They had the truth, but they would never have the justice they so desperately sought. They had waited for years, decades, for the moment when they could stand in a courtroom and face the man who had taken their sister's life. But that moment never came. Instead, they were left with the painful knowledge that, for all their efforts, the man responsible for Davy's death would never be made to answer for his crime. Stephanie Mollett, in her public statements, spoke for her family when she said, "It's not about him anymore. It's about Danni, and we will never stop fighting for her. The pain of the loss will never fade. But in their hearts, Danni's family holds on to the truth they've known all along, the truth that they carried for years, even when no one else would listen. They knew Danni was taken from them far too soon, and though justice would never come in the way they had hoped, their fight for her memory would never end." How does a family cope when they finally get the answers they've longed for, but the justice they've been denied still lingers in the shadows? Was closure truly achieved in this case? Or did the painful reality of an unsolved crime become yet another twist in a never-ending tragedy? How can a family move forward when the person who should have been held accountable is forever lost to the shadows of his own guilt? After nearly 3 decades, the truth was finally revealed, a case once thought unsolvable, cracked open by the relentless pursuit of justice. Though Hutchinson is gone, Danni's story, her life, will never be forgotten. The pursuit of justice for Danni may have come with heartache, twists, and an ending that wasn't expected, but in the end, her truth was brought to light. In the end, justice wasn't just about finding the killer, it was about remembering Danni for who she truly was. A daughter, a sister, a young girl with a bright future, lost too soon. Her family's fight for justice may have ended, but her legacy lives on. Will the truth ever be enough? For Danni's family, the answer is complicated. They got the answers they so desperately sought, but justice in its fullest sense was denied. Still, they carry on, honoring Danni's memory and holding tight to the love that she left behind. Her story is not just one of tragedy, but of resilience. Her life, though stolen too soon, will continue to inspire the generations who hear her story. And while justice may be elusive, her legacy is undeniable, etched in the hearts of those who loved her, and in the lasting impact of a fight that will never be forgotten. In the end, justice wasn't just about finding the killer, it was about remembering Danni for who she truly was. A daughter, a sister, a young girl with a bright future, lost too soon. Her family's fight for justice may have ended, but her legacy lives on. Danni's story is a reminder of the fight for justice, the resilience of a family, and the power of never giving up, even when it seems all hope is lost. Her legacy will endure, and her name will never be forgotten. If Danni's story has touched your heart, don't let her legacy fade away. Share her story with others. Help spread awareness about the fight for justice and the power of resilience. And if you want to hear more stories like hers, stories that highlight the fight for truth, the strength of families, and the pursuit of justice, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries, true crime cases, and stories that need to be heard. Subscribe now and join the conversation because the truth matters and we are just getting started.